Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to give it another minute. We have a number of people still popping in to the webinar, so just giving them a chance to connect. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We're very excited to have you for our Testing Efficiency February webinar. My name is Jenell McHenry, and I'm currently the Mid-Atlantic for our Nutrient Stewardship Association Executive Director. Very honored to be here this morning with our lineup and our updates that we're here to provide you. So just going to do a little background about who we are before we get the ball rolling. So the Mid-Atlantic for our Nutrient Stewardship Association is a nonprofit organization whose members include the Delaware, Maryland for our Alliance, as well as the Pennsylvania for our Alliance. Our mission is to empower entrusted advisors to ensure that every nutrient application in the Mid-Atlantic region is applied with the right source, in the right place, at the right rate, and at the right time to benefit the farmers, the environment, and the society. The association's inception was in 2017 and has continued to grow and prosper. I have been very excited to have been working with the Mid-Atlantic team full-time since December 16th, but also previously with a local agriculture consulting firm. So the Mid-Atlantic board is made up of representatives from 4 agribusinesses, the Delaware Maryland Agribusiness Association, as well as the Nature Conservancy. And then each state alliance has their own steering committee. Both the boards and the steering committees provide feedback and suggestions for the association to consider and are heavily involved in the succession of our organization. So in the last 8 years, we have received $2 million in grant funds, including state, federal, and private foundational dollars that have been used for 4R education and implementation. Through a number of meetings and events, we have exposed nearly 50,000 farms in Delaware, Maryland, and in Pennsylvania of 4R practices. In total, we have impacted 4R implementation on 226,279 acres through outreach, education, and direct coaching. We have also partnered with the Delaware Nutrient Management Commission to implement an annual supplemental 4R survey for data to be reported to the Chesapeake Bay program, ensuring farmers are getting credit for nutrient reductions that they are annually implementing. We created a benchmarking and assessment tool to help farmers determine where they are on the 4R continuum and what the next level implementation would be for them. Partners have run this tool directly with 1,050 farmers. We have also conducted a statistically significant survey on understanding social and economic barriers to 4R adoption to identify and overcome the barriers with farmers and technical assistance providers. And lastly, we have hosted a number of 4R webinars and events and will continue to do so. So thank you for being here today. So on our agenda, our first speaker, Nicole Fiorlino, has come down with a sickness. So you have Jarrod Miller, who's going to be talking about post-harvest, the management of post-harvest residues. I will be covering our cost share programs, and then we'll have Miss Veronica Nigh with the Fertilizer Institute covering the fertilizer market updates. For credits, we are offering a sign in and a sign out, which is a little different than we have in the past. So for today's webinar, we have been approved for 1.5 Delaware Nutrient Management credits, 2 Virginia Planner credits, 1.5 certified crop advisor nutrient management credits, as well as 2 Pennsylvania nutrient management credits. Maryland nutrient management credits are still currently pending. But as soon as we hear something, we will keep you guys posted. So I'm going to add the link to the credit sign-in sheet in the chat box. So please fill it out and just let them know you're here, and then we'll get the final sign out form at the conclusion of today's webinar. A few notes about the Mid-Atlantic 4R Association that I also wanted to touch on this morning is that through our 2025 voucher program, currently all 30 vouchers have been spoken for. So thank you to all the promotion and outreach and the work that you guys have done and your support of our program. We will be looking forward to possibly doing some small grain vouchers. So keep an eye out this summer or early fall for that program and what that's going to look like. And then if you are interested in future vouchers, we realized how quickly they've sold out. We're working on fixing that, but let us know if you're interested so that we can make sure that you guys are getting the information in a timely manner. And then if you're a little confused about that voucher program still and you want to understand it for yourself or for your growers, be sure to reach out. Happy to provide some clarity about how it works and what the expectations are. For 2025, we are still operating, but implementation dollars have been paused due to our 2024 National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant being frozen. So still a little unclear exactly how the year is going to play out, but we're still here. We're still operating that voucher program. We're still going to be building the 4R program. In 2024, we handed out 30 vouchers across the watershed. And we're very excited to report that 70% of those acres were implemented without funding. So farmers are seeing the work that the vouchers are doing and implementing it without the funding. And we thought that was very telling of the work that the agribusinesses are doing on the ground and for our adoption. And then I also wanted to add in the chat box an event survey. We are working on planning our annual event. We're looking at asking everyone, what time of year is best, where is best to meet, who do you like to hear from, etc. So if you could take a few seconds to complete that survey here today, we would appreciate any and all feedback, just so that we can best serve you guys and your interests and your availability. Moving into webinar reminders, just please stay muted during the presentations. You can raise your hand to ask questions, enter one in the chat box or through the question answer box, and we'll be doing questions after each presentation. So add them whenever you think of it and we'll get to them at the end. Happy to have you on, and we want to make sure that everyone has the chance to pick everyone's brains. And then before we get started, I had one interactive survey that I wanted to poll the group who's attending. So pull your cell phone out and give that QR code a scan. And we're going to do a little interactive survey to better understand our audience this morning. All right, so the first question, how did you hear about our presentation? So the code is now in this right corner. We got Mid-Atlantic email, you heard about it from a credit website, from a third party, word of mouth, or other. All right. We still have responses rolling in, so thanks for those who have their camera ready. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. I have 2 more questions. All right. So the second question, what position best describes your role? We have ag retailer for seed equipment or fertilizer. We've got government employee, farmer, crop consultant, extension agent, agriculture organization, or other. All right, Scott, you've raised your hand. Do you have a question? Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, I got you.
I just couldn't use the link because I was on with my phone, but I'm an ag retailer. Heard about it through Susan Jones's nutrient management email.
Thank you. All right, Tom, you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. My computer did a hard start, so I joined late. Is there anything I have to do to get this signed to get credits or any information you need?
Absolutely. So right now I'm adding in a link, and that is to sign in for credits.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then the second link is an event survey if you have time.
I have the survey.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Eric Rosenbaum, you should be able to unmute.
No, I'm good. I'm sorry. That was a mistake.
No, you're fine. And then Valerie, your hand was raised.
Yeah, I'm a fertilizer retailer as well. I wasn't sure how to get that information onto this because I was filling out the survey when you were doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So then I had one other question to pull the group. All right. So what brings you here today? Is it the presentation lineup, supporting 4Rs? You need credits or something else? All right, perfect. All right, let me make sure I didn't have any other questions this morning. Oh, I did. One others. Are there any upcoming events or opportunities that you would like to share with the group that you just think's relevant, not required, just optional? All right, so thank you guys for your responses this morning. We appreciate the honest feedback and excited to have you on. Our first presentation is going to be with Mr. Jarrod Miller. Jarrod has his PhD from the University of Kentucky, and currently works at the University of Delaware as an extension specialist in agronomy. Jarrod researches precision ag technologies that can make farms more economically and environmentally efficient. Today, Jarrod is here to share some findings on post-harvest residuals and management of them. So you should be good, Jarrod. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, thanks, Jenell. Happy to be here. So just for a talk on post-harvest residues, because there's some more removal of residues going across the region than there might have been in the past. So this has some research information in it, but mostly it's an overview of talking about crop residues in the Mid-Atlantic. So cover crop residues would be a different question because that's more in the growing season, and all the benefits you might see from the residues we're going to mention here are also happening with cover crops, because most of our cover crops are either cereals or legumes. So a lot of it overlaps, but most of this discussion is about managing these residues after we've harvested. So for the Mid-Atlantic, that's going to include cereals. So we have our cereals over here. So we've got some corn residue. So obviously some cover crop planted in that corn. And then also we could have wheat and barley residues in the summer. So you'd have these residues left on the surface of soil. And then we can also discuss legumes, which would be soybean in our region. But of course, as you're going to see with soybean residue, we don't usually talk about managing those residues as much because of how quickly they might break down. The reason that cereal residues might be removed from the soil is going to be some of the issues you might have with them, as well as the use that they might have in other industries. Whereas legumes typically they break down in the field before you're even going to remove them. And then we also have to think about the parts of these plants that are left. There's leaves and stems. Obviously, we might have different, we'll talk about C/N ratios and nitrogen content in those leaves, how quickly they break down.
Can
So
I
you have the
pause
leaves.
for 1 second? Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you have slides up?
You can't see them?
I cannot.
Okay, hold on. Let me do it again. I thought this thing shared. Let's start over.
Okay. It's loading.
All right,
Perfect.
is it up now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
All right, so here's the first image. I thought I was marking all this stuff and showing everybody what we're talking about. But so you have the cereals on the left. So we have corn residue. We have our rye cover crop growing in that residue. And then we have our small grains, it can be wheat or barley. And then of course, our legume, which would be soybean in our region. So if you're talking about cover crops, this would be replaced by clover or vetch. And then we have our leaves. Obviously, soybean leaves already falling and the stems within there. Same thing with corn, long stalks and stems, our leaf. And then also husks and cobs. You might have pods left over from the soybean, but the leaves on the husk and then the cob in here and the corn also gets left behind. And you'll see why those are important later when we talk about C/N ratio. So what are some functions of residue and why would we want to leave them on the field, or what drawbacks might there be to residues? And these are going to be relative to the potential for erosion or moisture holding. So they do all these things, but it all really depends on whether or not you need it. So the great thing about any residue is it acts like a mulch layer on the surface of the soil. And we don't always think about it. We don't consider as much in the Mid-Atlantic region because we get enough rainfall that we aren't always trying to conserve moisture. But if you have a rain-fed field, and we've certainly seen it a lot with cover crops, that a lot of those mulches in the summer, if you don't have irrigation, do hold moisture in the soil that we get. We don't think about it in the fall because there's not a crop there, but if you have cover crops, having this residue is going to hold moisture in the soil if we get rainfall. And if you remember this past fall, we had very dry conditions. We had a lot of issues with getting cover crops established this fall. So the residue here will hold moisture in the soil. So in the winter time where we have a lot of recharge of the soil, it's not being evaporated out, it's not being used. Any rainfall that hits, if you can hold it, it moves down in the profile, could possibly be stored for later in the year. So they definitely act as a mulch layer for moisture. We just don't consider it as much here. Out in western states where it's drier, they like residues because they will capture snow. So there's a benefit to having standing residues, certainly cover crops, but any of these residues are going to capture snow and holds more moisture in the soil. So this is important in drier climates, but it would also be important if you had a rain-fed field and if you wanted moisture to be stored. A lot of our soils are going to have potentially higher clay deeper in the soil, and the more water that can push down through there, the more storage you have in those lower layers, it's less likely to evaporate out of the soil. And then one of our biggest things for having any residues all that does apply to our region is limiting rainfall impact. So you're still going to have some erosion if you have high enough rainfall, but one thing that residue does is it stops the impact of a raindrop, which is going to break up the soil, potentially break up aggregates, loosen it, but also any kind of, and this is irrigation moving water, it's not raining, but you can see that if you have no residue and you've tilled your soil, how easy it is to create channels and erode. So the value of this as a mulch layer really depends on what situation you have, like how likely are you to have erosion? What's the value of the loss in that soil, which can be pretty significant? And what are the conditions on holding moisture in your soil? So there's a definite value as a mulch layer on the surface. It's also going to be, all of these residues are a reservoir of nutrients and carbon. And the one we talk about the most is nitrogen. We're always discussing nitrogen, but the great thing about plant residues, and same thing with manures, is every single potential nutrient that was in that plant is in the residue. It might be at different ratios and it might have different release rates, but it's all there. So any nutrient that's in the soil, of course, is carried into the roots and into the plant tissue. So the residues that are left behind are going to have all those nutrients and they're going to move them into the surface. So any kind of, the better that you grow, the higher the yield of any corn crop or soybean crop, it probably means the better root system you had and the more nutrients they kept from leaching out of the soil and they carry into their tissues. All those residues break down slowly, so we can consider them sort of a slow release, and it helps hold those nutrients in place. So any residue left on the field is going to be a reservoir of nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium are just some of them. And these are cover crop residues. So as an example, but it would be legumes and cereal. So here's your rye, not a lot of nitrogen, not a lot of anything in the residue. This is parts per million. Or clover and vetch have more nitrogen, vetch had more phosphorus. So there's a range. Even though these residues all have nutrients, they're going to have a different amount of nutrients in them depending on their the content of them. And you'd have to look up the values for those if you were trying to count on how much you would get back. But besides that, it's also a reservoir for carbon. So carbon is going to dominate all these plant tissues. You don't fertilize with carbon, it's pulling it from CO2 out of the atmosphere. But all these residues are going to build up in carbon, which is organic matter. It's our carbon sequestration that we discussed. So any of that carbon is probably a surface residue, but it's going to be that component that could build organic matter in your soil, which is a very important component of soil quality and soil health and nutrient holding. But we always have to remember about these residues, and when we talk about maintaining residue in the field and doing things like no-till and building soil health, that a lot of our nutrients that we're growing this food for is supposed to be shipped off the field. So we always have to fertilize. So you can cycle some nutrients in place, but it all depends on what you were harvesting and where you were sending the nutrients. So in this case, corn grain on the left, all the nutrients from the grain is gone. It's shipped off the field to feed animals, to feed people, in some cases to go into ethanol. You also depends on how you're harvesting. And over here on the right, we have silage harvest. And if you look very clearly, you see a lot of residue on the field after a grain harvest. But here we're using the residue as a silage, as a feed. And so the entire plant is being chopped for feed for animals. So the amount of nutrients left depends on how you harvest and what you're harvesting and the type of crop you have. But always some of those nutrients are meant to be as a feed. So we have to replace something. So yes, they can hold nutrients in place. No, they're not going to hold enough to produce a crop in the next year. Something always has to be replaced from what we've harvested. Then you can think about, well, what are the nutrient values of the residues? Now, this is going to vary, and it's going to vary based on the cost of fertilizer that year and how well your crop did and how much residue is left on the field. So this is from Penn State. It's a little older, and the prices at that time were a little lower for nitrogen. We might have been up to 64 cents, I think, over the last couple of years. But there's going to be all these nutrients in there, and typically we discuss NPK because their macronutrients are the most value, but all the micronutrients are in here as well. Everything is in there, and having a micronutrient at the surface that's in a residue means it's going to break down and release micronutrients, particularly the metals, zinc and manganese, love to bond to the soil. So any micronutrient in that residue that's going to break down slowly, as it warms up in the spring, is going to be released and potentially more plant available than something that's in the soil and is already bonded to it, and your pH might be too high. And it's another discussion, but all the nutrients are in there. But because there's so much value and so much more NPK, they're typically what's discussed. But don't forget about all the micronutrients and the sulfur and everything else that could be in that residue. So here for nitrogen, If it's worth about 59 cents a pound and there's about 22 pounds of nitrogen per ton, then you have about $13 a ton is the value of that nitrogen, $5 a ton for phosphate and $13 a ton for potassium based on these prices. And then you have to think about, well, how many tons per acre of fodder did you have left? And this is for corn fodder. 200 bushels of corn might produce 4.7 tons per acre. It could, if in the maximum amount of fodder they might expect, and it could be up to 150 pounds of K2O that you're cycling in place. And potassium is usually the nutrient we talk about the most on removal because so much of it is in the leaves and stems. Potassium also immediately leaches out of a plant. It's used by plants in their stomates, the openings on the bottom of the leaves that control evaporation from the plant. It's in there as a salt to help open and close the stomates. So it's not tied up in residues. Where I've mentioned that micronutrients might need to mineralize or slowly release. Potassium is released pretty quickly. And so if you leave residue in the field, it's easier for that potassium to leach out and get back into your soil versus some of the other nutrients that have to mineralize. And the residue does matter. And what you're looking at here is cover crops, but it's cover crops following a soybean from last year. And we have so you can see over here on the right, we have a research project where we're doing long-term cover cropping to build carbon in the soils. And then we're planting corn and soybean behind it. But we let the cover crops go as nuts as they want to go and build up as much biomass as possible. And this year we had soybean. And so this line, these yellow lines that you're seeing here is where we cut alleys between our plots. So we shave off the ends so they don't mess with the data. Anything that's on an end is considered to be maybe a statistical anomaly. So across here, before we even harvested the soybean, we mowed an alley in. So all the grain and all the residue earlier in the fall was mowed down and left there to mineralize and release the nutrients, which is that we weren't trying to release the nutrients. But that's just what happened. So what you're seeing in here, you can see the rye here, and you can see the rye in our alleys, how much better it grew. Same thing with the clover that was here, and the clover's not sick. Also very clear here. We had a lot of rye here, and it's a lot shorter there. So what happened with this soybean residue by mowing it down earlier and not harvesting, all the grain that was left there, all the nitrogen was released, and it fed this cover crop in the fall. So there is a value to the residue that's left behind for nutrients. However, you have to understand what that value might be. So how do residues cycle as nutrients in the soil? You have to know the C to N ratio. So soil biology is like everything else. It likes to have a balanced C to N ratio. It likes to have all the nutrients. So if you have too much carbon, which is their nitrogen, their energy source, then they're going to steal your nitrogen from the soil to make up that balance. So if you have a C to N less than 20, that means you only have 20 times more carbon than nitrogen. There's a net release of nitrogen. So that residue is going to release nitrogen to your soil. If your C to N is above 30, it means that the microbes are more than likely going to steal nitrogen from your soil. So residues with more nitrogen have lower C to N ratios and faster breakdowns. So that would be soybean versus corn. And it is important the type of residue that you have. And even though we talk about post-harvest management of residues, it's typically cereals we're talking about management because they have a higher C to N and they're left behind. Soybean, you see the soybeans planted in April, it's already lost its leaves before we even harvest it, unlike corn. And so the leaves are possibly even breaking down and releasing nutrients earlier. And if you lift up soybean leaves, a lot of times you can see things like these worm casts underneath the leaves in the fall where they're already in there breaking down these residues. So soybean leaves can drop earlier. They have a lower C to N, but when you plant matters, the maturity group does matter. Corn leaves remain on the plant until harvest. They have a higher C to N. They're more likely to be left on the field and at a cooler time of year where they might not break down. And so this points towards a greater breakdown of soybean leaves in the fall. So yes, soybean residue could be managed. And I grew up on a farm where we would bale soybean residue sometimes for bedding for animals. But really, when we talk about management of residues, we're really focused on the high C to N. And you can see it clearly here, how residues don't break down. It's against a cover crop, but it's just a really good image. This is that same long-term cover crop study. So here's your rye residue, And you can already see your vetch is breaking down so much quicker that it's going to be gone, because that high seed N ratio, you can build a lot of vetch biomass. It's going to break down because it has a more balanced nutrient content for the microbes to break down. Whereas this rye, if you want a mulch layer for weeds and for moisture, it's going to stick around. If you want nitrogen, you pick vetch. So the same thing happens with soybean versus corn. Then we come back to the discussion of what kind of residues are there. So this is for corn plant. We're looking at nitrogen release from a study that I didn't copy the name on here, but here you have the grams of nitrogen released in cobs over cumulative growing degree days, so almost nothing. You can see the leaves quickly lose their nitrogen because they have a better seed to N ratio within the corn crop. Same thing with husks. Husks have some nitrogen, they release it. Stems release a little bit at first, but they're pretty steady. It's also, you can look at residue mass. How quickly does it break down? Well, leaves with a better C to N ratio break down quicker. All that biomass is gone. Your cobs break down, your stems break down, and your husks, but they're all slower. The leaves are a lot faster, which the husks would be the same. So almost all nitrogen is released from the leaves, and very little from the cobs. So cobs have the lowest breakdown. So the parts of the plant also matter in terms of what's left behind and how much nitrogen you might get out of those tissues. But when we talk about immobilization and how a high C to N is going to immobilize and steal your nitrogen, you always have to keep in mind it has to have contact with that nitrogen. So if you dribble nitrogen on top of corn residue, then yes, you're going to tie it up. If you put it beneath the soil and it has no contact with that high C to N ratio, it's less likely to tie it up. You have to have the residue, the nitrogen you're applying, and the microbes. They all have to be together to cause this issue. And you can see it in this study, which you can look up from the SSA journal, residue incorporation, nitrogen release from cereal, rye, and tillage radish. Here's your cover crop. Here's the amount of nitrogen released early in the season. If you see cereal rye, lowest amount of nitrogen released, and particularly when it's buried in the soil. So once you move it into the soil, and it's working with nitrogen and microbes in the soil, then it's immobilizing nitrogen. Then it's not releasing it. But over time, if you have enough time, they all release their nitrogen. So the C to N is important, but it's also the residue sitting on the surface isn't tying up your nitrogen unless you mix it into the soil or you dribble nitrogen on top. So the location of that residue does matter, and how quickly it breaks down will matter because of its interaction with soil microbes. And then you think, well, I have all this residue, all that rye residue, look at all that great organic matter. But remember, most of that CO2 is pulled into the plant from the atmosphere, and most of that CO2 is going back to the atmosphere. They're respiring this. As microbes are breaking this down for energy, they're breathing out, they're releasing that carbon. They're not necessarily mixing it into the soil. So this is May to September, rye residues in bags, so they can't just blow away. And this carbon didn't work its way into the soil by the end of the season. It ended up being respired. A lot of it went off in the atmosphere. So you can build a lot of residue, but it doesn't mean it's going to become organic matter. The more residue you have, the more you leave in place, the more likely you build it. But all of that residue is not becoming organic matter. Most of it is going to be respired back off into the atmosphere. Still, the good news is, outside of nitrogen, most nutrients don't become gases. So all the potassium, manganese, all that was here. It didn't leave. It's just this were other micronutrients. This is what's left. This is what's not. All the carbon that was respired, all those nutrients that were needed in smaller amounts. This was a study that we were doing and still doing that's looking at residue breakdowns. We're putting these bags in soybean row spacing because the tighter your row spacing is, it changes that microclimate in there, the moisture holding and the temperature. And what we saw in this study over this year was that if you were in 15-inch rows in irrigated fields, the residue broke down a lot faster. So we lost almost 70% of our residue in this field where we only lost about 57% in a 30-inch row. So in a wider row in the field where it might have been drier that year, even if we have irrigation, we ended up slowing down the process of breakdown. So the environment that residue is in, the amount of moisture, the temperature, all of that matters. But still, the 70% loss means it was gone. It was in these bags. So the majority of that residue broke down. Did it release nutrients? Yes, which was what we wanted. Is the carbon necessarily going in the soil? No, it's not as likely. You have to find a way to incorporate and get that into the soil. So how do we manage residues? Well, one thing you can do, which we do a lot, is leave them in place and then maybe just mow the stalks. But this can cause planting issues. We had it with our cover crops this year. When you have a 300 bushel corn crop, you have a lot of leaves and residue behind. And then you can have, particularly if you're looking at planting a cover crop, you can cause hairpinning. You can have issues, especially we found with legumes, the smaller seeds, getting them into the soil and getting good seed to soil contact, getting good germination. So you can have, although there's all these benefits to residue, there's a reason people might want to manage or reduce their impact on the surface, because if you're trying to plant something behind it, it's not just nitrogen issues, you can have planting and germination issues. And I've seen it plenty of times with cover crops. If you're drilling, if you're flying on with a plane, you're not going to get that seed to soil contact. So it gets a little difficult, which is why sometimes we turbo till and try to work things into the field. So if you're trying to plant a cover crop, that residue can be a problem. If you're trying to plant a small grain behind that residue, it can be a problem. You can do tillage and incorporation, but now we know if you incorporate that residue, you're more likely to reduce nitrogen contents in the field temporarily. It doesn't go anywhere, but you could introduce nitrogen immobilization. So if you're growing a small grain, incorporating that residue might actually end up stealing more of your nitrogen, and it's going to be field to field. Another thing that's done pretty often, and I grew up doing this for cattle bedding, would be baling. So you can see this baled corn fodder, and you can remove a lot of residue off the field. It can have value as biofuel. It can be used as compost for mushroom. Bales can be fed. A lot of the work on baling corn residues is done in the Midwest, where they might not have, if in drier climate, they might not have as many forages that year. Then you can feed off of these residues. When I was a kid, what we used this for was bedding for cows. So that bedding ends up getting returned to the field. So in that case, the nutrient and carbon content, some of that actually gets returned to the field if it's being used as a bedding in the region. So if you can bale it and remove these residues, grazing is something else that's done. I don't find it to be as likely, at least here in Delaware, we're not grazing these residues. But the nice thing about grazing, it's going to recycle a lot of those nutrients in place. So it's not as effective at removing residues as baling might be. In Nebraska, where they do a lot of work like this, these are their baling recommendations. And so they kind of point out the importance of residue, that you can do this, but when you overdo it, you cause more issues. So they recommend that if you bale, you use reduced tillage, where you remove the residue. So they're really looking at wind erosion and water erosion. Only harvest residue when fields are over 180 bushels per acre. So they're saying if you didn't have a high yield, you didn't have a lot of residue, then you don't want to remove it, because you're going to cause these other issues with your soil quality. Avoid slopes greater than 5%. That's an erosion issue. Avoid removing more than 2 tons. Leave at least 2 tons on top of the field. In continuous corn, they recommend every other year, and corn soybean every 4 years. So they have a drier climate. They have more wind erosion. They have different issues than us, but you can see the point for them. And we haven't done this kind of research here about how much residue you could leave on the field, is that yes, you can remove some, but you have to be careful about taking everything, because there are benefits to it. Particularly the focus with them, and I think with us would be as well, is reducing erosion, reducing water erosion and wind erosion of your soils. So, and then of course, apply manure or use a cover crop for amelioration of the soil if you do any of this. There are plenty of other studies that have done this. Again, a lot of them in drier climates, but straw removed through baling. Don't remove more than 40%. Heavy grazing or baling can reduce wind erosion potential. Baling causes more losses of soil, carbon, and nutrients than grazing. So yes, you can remove some, but you end up losing some of the benefits of having that residue if you do it. So in summary, crop residues are mostly a benefit. And we already knew a lot of this, but the question is, how much damage can it cause if you start to bale those residues? There can be too much of a good thing. There's no doubt they have to be managed. It's not like you just leave the residue there and everything works out. If you're going to make a recommendation to a farmer, to leave their residue and it ends up messing with the stand of their small grain or tying up their nitrogen, then you've introduced another issue. You need to manage both sides of this. How do you make sure that you get the benefits with residue while minimizing the drawbacks? And so immobilization is a big one, and then planting issues as well you have to worry about. A limited amount of residue can be removed, but it really depends on the goals. This is a field-to-field, farm-to-farm operation, and question about what benefits are you getting from the additional income versus what are the drawbacks, how much nutrient did you lose, and how much carbon might have you lost from these soils. So if you guys have any questions, you can put some things not in the chat but the Q&A. Otherwise, we could save them to the end if Jenell wants to keep going. Stop sharing. Make Jenell the host. Oh, got it.
Thank you, Jarrod, so much. Yeah, as Jarrod said, if you have any questions, you can definitely put them in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand. And if he stays on, we're absolutely welcome to ask them later on as well. So I'll give you guys a few minutes. All right, Jarrod, we have one question. If a farm wants to plant wheat after 200 plus corn grain yield, and we do tillage to create an ideal seed bed, how much nitrogen fertilizer would be needed to overcome immobilization?
I think for the question like that, it depends on where you're at, because you're gonna be regulated based on the nitrate content in your field. So you probably, I don't have the numbers on that. You would have to do a soil test how much nitrate is in your field, but I've definitely seen it happen. You might just need something like 20 pounds of nitrogen versus you wouldn't need a lot to overcome it, especially when you're just looking at getting something started. But you're best to work with a consultant and possibly take some soil samples. Or if you're doing tillage, depends on how much residue you mixed into the soil. It really does. I vary across the field. You wouldn't need a lot, but yes, you could need some.
Thank you for that. And like I said, pop the questions in and we can definitely get to them later. We appreciate the question in general. And thank you so much, Jarrod, for your presentation. I know it's been a topic of conversation that we have had and have heard from our committee members, etc. So thank you for your time this morning. Moving on to the next presentation, I am here today to share more about some cost share findings of the work that we have done the past 3 years through our 2020 National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant. So to begin, I wanted to touch base on some findings that we had from a survey. So through our grant, we have completed a barrier communication survey. This was a mailed survey that was sent randomly to farmers in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, as well as Virginia. And the purpose was to understand the barriers for our adoption. So the average respondent was 60 years old with 630 acres, most of which were leased. Results included on-farm trials being the most helpful and learning about 4R practices, and the most influential sources of information coming from trusted advisors. Therefore, we took these results to the next level to interact with the trusted advisors to see what they knew about 4R practices and the best method of communication to them. So we did 3 focus groups back in 2023, one for Maryland, one for Delaware, and one for Pennsylvania to understand that barrier. So in general, we've changed our audience from farmers to trusted advisors from these findings. So today our goal is to serve trusted advisors by demonstrating to them how 4R best management practices can help them help their customers. Trusted advisors include ag retailers, agronomy consultants, cooperative extension, as well as soil conservation agencies. All right, so the last 4 years, we have offered cost share to farmers across the Chesapeake Bay watershed to adopt 4R practices. This funding was provided by a 2020 National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant. For 2021, we paid farmers $15 an acre to add an additional split of nitrogen to their corn crop. We adopted split nitrogen for the first year on 3,596 acres. For 2022, we continued the $15 an acre incentive, but then we also included that $500 technical service provider payment. And that was from the findings that we had that we're not the trusted advisors. These are the trusted advisors. They already have these relationships and the ability to connect with farmers, to encourage adoption, but also report back on the data so that we could pull some data together. So that incentive went out to every technical service provider for every farmer that they signed up. That year, we adopted split nitrogen on 4,162 acres. For 2023, we continued with the $15 an acre program, as well as a $500 payment to the technical service provider, and we adopted split nitrogen on 5,924 acres. Then for the last year, and due to the fact that farmers in our watershed they're advanced. They were already timing their nitrogen applications efficiently. And due to that, as well as the fact that custom application increased over the time, we increased our cost share to $20 an acre. And then we added the opportunity for farmers to test out biologicals. So therefore, on the last year, we had 855 acres of split nitrogen and 7,393 acres of biological trials, totaling implementation of 4R on 8,248 acres. All right, so for 2024, our goal was to allow farmers to make choice comparisons. So as the survey found, is farmers do best when they can see results on their own land themselves. Our other goal was to increase nitrogen use efficiency, as that is our 4R goal, and also to determine the return on investment. All right, sorry, I was seeing what that question was, but I'll leave that for later. So we're allowing farmers to see the results so that they can share the results with others, and we're allowing agribusinesses to continue to be involved. But to keep in mind, last year we definitely faced drought across the region. So we have 3 photos, one from June where you can see where it starts to get abnormally dry, moderate dry to severe drought, and then in August, definitely an extreme drought in portions of the state and further. So typically in our region, we like to see about 45 inches of rain. And we were well below that average this year and experienced a very dry spring, summer, and fall. You can definitely tell with the cover crop across the area. And we also noticed that it was very spotty. So certain parts of the county or certain parts of the state may have had a pretty good rainfall, whereas others definitely were affected more strongly. With that being said, some of our planned split nitrogen comparisons were unsuccessful because of the dry weather. Farmers were deciding not to apply that additional split of nitrogen through side dress, or they were changing their game plan up to be economically efficient. All right, so for split nitrogen, it's all about the timing of nitrogen. So that is the purpose of the cost share that we had. Our trials included the normal nitrogen rate, with your baseline number of applications. So if you were typically applying 2 applications, you continued that. And then we asked you to do the same rate. So if you were doing 150 pounds of nitrogen, you were still doing 150 pounds, but you were going to do 3 splits. So you're adding that additional split, and how you change that up was whatever was most convenient and available to that farmer. So in general, the Middle Atlantic 4Rs include applying the right nutrient source at the right rate, in the right place, and at the right time. So through the split nitrogen, we were focusing on feeding the corn crop throughout the growing season when the corn needed the nitrogen the most. So therefore, every farm looked a little bit different depending on what equipment and services they had available to the farmer. But each farmer still had those 2 requirements to provide. All right, so looking at split nitrogen field comparisons in Pennsylvania. So if we're looking at our chart, let's keep in mind that there's going to be variation with weather, the size of the check strip, as well as the location of the check strip, the number of timing of splits tested, the cover crop nitrogen tie-up, and the pest management challenges. So this is a full lens scope of all 4 years of Pennsylvania. So out of the 4 years, we had 49 total different farmers enrolled. We had 11,020 acres completely enrolled. So the percentage of acres with the added split that increased yield averaged out at 98%. The range of yield achieved with the added split averaged out to -30 to 39 bushels to the acre. And then the average yield increase from the added split came to 18 bushels to the acre. So looking at Pennsylvania as a total average, if you're looking at $4.50 corn, you're increasing your income at $81 an acre. So if that covers that extra pass, then we're happy to see those positive findings. So that's something for the farmer to bounce back and forth. In Pennsylvania, we saw a little bit of different splits happening, what was ever best for that operation. Moving on to the comparisons for Maryland and Delaware, same variations in place. Through the 4 years, we had 10 different farmers enroll with 3,570 acres. And I wanted to touch a base on the difference of 11,000 and 3,500 for enrollment, is we found that a lot of farmers in the Maryland and Delaware region felt as if they couldn't add any more splits. So we typically saw Pennsylvania going from pre-emergence to adding a side dress, whereas Maryland, Delaware was doing 3 applications already, or 2 applications, and we were asking them to do a 3rd. So the percentage of acres with the added split that increased yield averaged out to 90%. The range of yield achieved with the added split went from -7 to 39 bushels to the acre. So the average yield increase with the added split was 8 bushels to the acre. So we definitely still saw positive results here. The lower average yield increase with the added split in Maryland and Delaware are likely due to the splits already being a little bit more significant than in Pennsylvania. So that's why the yield was probably not as large. So with that being said, that gives the farmer an additional $36 an acre at $4.50 corn if they want to make that decision to do that additional split or not. Looking specifically at 2 case studies, in 2021, Pennsylvania has a case study where they added 20 pounds of nitrogen through manure history. Then they separated their pre-emergence at 130 for the control, and then 65 for the additional split. And then they did the side dress at 68. So we got 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the control, 153 pounds of nitrogen in the added split, and a yield increase of 35 bushels to the acre. So the nitrogen use efficiency was definitely a lot stronger at 0.79 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn. And our increase of revenue came to $189 per acre, so a 22% increase. These numbers were utilized with the averages for 2021. So and was at $370 a ton. Corn was priced at $6.08 a bushel, and then the custom application rate for side dress was $15 an acre. Moving on to a case study in Delaware specifically, we both had, both the control and the split had 71 pounds of pre-emergent nitrogen. The split was broken down at side dress at V6 and past V6, so 160 for the control, 110, and then 150 coming back after V6. So total pounds was 231 pounds of nitrogen. We saw a yield increase of 10 bushels to the acre, a nitrogen use efficiency of 1.27 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn, with an increased revenue of $55 an acre for 5%. Also noting the price of nitrogen at $4.86 a ton, corn at $7, and then the custom rate for side dress at $15. I also wanted to note that when looking at this, pre-emergent nitrogen could still include multiple passes. For example, if someone's putting nitrogen in for planting and then they come with a liquid broadcast in a day or two later, those are both still considered pre-emergence nitrogen. So just wanting to bring that to the group's attention as well. So that covers all of our split nitrogen data and findings from the 4 years. So thank you to the farmers who participated and the agribusinesses that assisted with that program. Very excited to see those results over the past 4 years. And if there's any questions about that, we'll take it near the end. So as mentioned earlier, during 2023, our team revisited our grant and our goals. Split nitrogen was a hard adoption because it was being implemented across the region, but biologicals were also a very huge conversation amongst the ag community. You know, are they worth it? Do we try them? This is what they cost an acre. You know, do we want to take that gamble? So therefore, we provided funding to help lower the barrier and allow farmers to get those field comparisons that they want. And it also covers the opportunity to discuss right time, right source, and right placement with that farmer because they're looking at their program. So before we dig into the data, let's keep in mind that the drought faced everyone in 2024. So our data is only a demonstration and we were unable to draw a conclusion, especially with only 1 year data. So for 2024, we offered $20 an acre for farmers to test a biological of their choice. The goal was for them to utilize the product and to replace nitrogen. Therefore, the trials had a normal nitrogen rate with the product, the normal nitrogen rate without the product, and then the reduced nitrogen rate that the product claims. So for example, Pivot claims a 40-pound reduction. So if you were planting Pivot, you had to have a strip with 40 pounds less nitrogen than normal with the biological so that we could compare the 3 different comparisons. And then this is totally dependent upon the farmer's practices. So looking at field comparisons, remembering that corn was at $4.50 a bushel last year, nitrogen was at 50 cents per pound, and the biological typically cost about $18 an acre. Variation was definitely involved with weather, check strip size and location, the product used, etc. So looking at the map, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, we had 10 farmers enrolled. In Delaware, Maryland, we had 10 farmers enrolled with a total of 20 total farmers. We had 7,391 total acres implemented. So relative to business as usual nitrogen rate, farmers gaining profit with the biological at the normal nitrogen rate was at 2 farmers for 20. But if you included that cost share incentive, it was 40% of the farmers for Pennsylvania. And then 0 of the Maryland and Delaware farmers did not gain profit from utilizing the biological. 2 did with the cost share incentive. So just to provide some clarity with that statement, they didn't gain income from utilizing the biological product. I'm trying to figure out the best way to. So they did not gain profit from adding the biological. They still profited on their acres just as much as if they stuck, just not as much as if they stuck to business as usual. So we can't pinpoint the loss specifically to the biological because of the other variations that were still in place. The trials were also not replicated, so that's something that we want to keep in mind. So because the data was not strong enough to provide clear and definite acres, we decided to put this map together to compare the income generated from the corn grain year with the cost of nitrogen and the cost of biological. And for the record, most of our farmers used Pivot. We had a handful using Source and then a few using a product called Invita. And then looking at gaining profit with the reduced rate, we had 3, and then 4 with cost share, and then 1 in Delaware, Maryland, and then 2 were cost share. So the reduction definitely took place. All right, so looking at water quality, not all of our data is accounted for, but we're working on adding it into the field doc still from 2024. But by implementing split nitrogen practices on your farm, not only benefits the farmers, but also as a return of investment, but it increases water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. So thus far, we have seen 60,190 pounds of nitrogen reduced per year, 1,909 pounds of phosphorus reduced per year, and then 1.37 pounds of suspended solids reduced per year. So to wrap things up, thank you to all of our farmers and trusted advisors who have worked with us the past 4 years to grow our program. Thank you to those who have volunteered their time for our program by serving on our board or our steering committee. And thank you for you guys coming today to hear more about the work that we're doing and what we're finding. Also, thank you to the Keith Campbell Foundation as well as the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for their continued support of our program and the work that we're doing. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, raise your hand, and we will definitely get to them. All right. So Jarrod was answering Eric's question. So that one's squared away. Is this a large enough number of data points to make a popular conclusion? So anonymous attendee, are you referring to biologicals or split nitrogen? And then looking at the other response, the 2024 biological data indicates biologicals are not effective. Is that the message, or was it just very related to dry weather? So for the biologicals, we saw some fields that had an impact from biologicals and some fields that did not. We're still trying to figure out, was that impact specifically off the dry weather? We're not seeing enough of a trend to say yes or no. So we don't really have enough data, and we need a few more years to be able to say yes or no if the biologicals is affecting or helping. So it is not, there's not enough trends to be clear, so we're not sure. And then for the split nitrogen, is there enough number of data points to make a proper conclusion? So for split nitrogen, I would say we have a good bit of data. The data is widespread across the watershed, and it definitely ranges on the practice of the split as well as the weather. And we're seeing positive results with split nitrogen, but we can't say if you add this split, you will see this investment. Any other questions? Perfect. Let me get our next speaker squared away while we see if there's any others that come in. Veronica, are you with us?
I am.
Awesome. Let me get the ball rolling, then you're welcome to start sharing your screen. So to wrap up today's presentation, our last speaker is Veronica Nigh with the Fertilizer Institute. Veronica serves as the senior economist at TFI. TFI is the leading voice of the fertilizer industry, acting as an advocate for fair regulation and legislation, a consistent source for trusted information and data. So Veronica is here today to share some insight on the U.S. fertilizer market. Please welcome Veronica.
Thanks very much, Jenell. And I don't know if anyone will like this or not, but would you mind starting my video?
So I'm changing you to the host, so you should be able to now.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if that made it better or worse for folks, but hey, I'm just going to say it's better. But thanks very much for inviting me to join you all today. Unfortunately, I'm based in DC, so the amount of space that you give me, I will take it all up. We're going to talk about a variety of different things today, and you will sense an overall theme as we get towards the end is that probably the thing that we here at TFI are the most concerned about on February 24th, 2025 is related to tariffs and the amount of volatility that potentially, well, we've already seen the threat of those tariffs creating a lot of volatility in the market, but the stay sort of that we experienced from the administration, where those tariffs on Canada and Mexico products were intended to go into effect on February 1st. We got a 30-day reprieve for Canada and Mexico to work out deals with the U.S. February, as we all know, is coming to an end, and those 30 days sure didn't last very long. So as we look at the market volatility and the potential for that to cause challenges for receiving product and having a significant impact on price points, we're going to talk about that multiple times throughout the presentation. But let's see, there we go. So today I want to talk about sort of the longer term perspectives first on global S&D and the fertilizer market. And then when I talk about the US, we want to talk about the US economy at large because of its larger influence, mostly on the policy, in the policy realm. Obviously, we're going to talk about net farm income for a few minutes, and then for US fertilizer S&D considerations. And then the third segment, which I already alluded to, we're going to talk about those policy considerations and largely the impact and the potential impact of changing trade dynamics. So as we let's start here and talk about the monthly fertilizer prices. Now these are, you'll see potash and ammonia, these are Corn Belt prices. DAP is a Southeast price. The potash and ammonia price, y'all are probably getting a slightly different volatility on those prices than they are in the Corn Belt. But given that we see a huge amount of use in that area, we tend to talk about Corn Belt prices. So my apologies on that regard. But so this graph is obviously looking from January 2019 through January 2025. And I include back to January 2019 because, you know, I think from a grower perspective, everything is a bit measured against that basis, the 2019 price points. And we'll talk about here in a minute whether or not that, you know, is accurate for the fertilizer at large. But all humans have that tendency. We tend to measure the highs against the lows. And prior to 2020, we were in a pretty low relatively price environment for fertilizer. And so obviously we're in 2024, significantly more stability than we saw in 2021 and 2022. But still above those 2019 levels. So growers are still, and particularly in a low commodity price environment, still feeling the impacts, of course, of those relative to 2019 higher prices. As we look sort of at a 10-year average, though, we largely see ammonia and potash prices in 2024 were largely at that 10-year average. DAP remains elevated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you know, from here, the potash prices here in blue certainly helping to pull that average down, and that's you know, sort of in the back of my brain as I'm thinking about growers and their decisions into the spring. The fact that that potash was putting downward pressure on the overall fertilizer picture, and now we're talking about it potentially coming up as a result of potential trade actions. That's of concern. So I also hear, and I went further back on this, is to look at USDA NASS producer paid index for fertilizer, and it, you know, the sort of dashed line is the fertilizer at large. Red is mixed fertilizer, nitrogen is green, and potash and phosphate are combined in purple. And I put this up here to from the perspective of, you know, this is measuring against 2011, where the index was set at 100. You can just read this chart as anything below the 100 is obviously a lower price than what was being experienced in 2011, versus anything above is elevated. So I say that to mention, and this is a bit going back to that, the fact that prices are more in line with the 10-year average at this point. We see, again, a bit elevated over that teal line, if you will, but not by a huge margin. You know, at, let's say 10% above a 2011 price. But from a grower perspective, they obviously are measuring these prices against what they were paying here in 2019, and they measured these price spikes against 2019. So the volatility still is we've seen a significant calm down in that volatility, but the ways in which it can crop up are certainly still at the front of growers' minds, retailers' minds, and those fertilizer producers as they're thinking about the length of forward contracting that they're willing to do. So I'll stop here and just mention that 90% of global nutrient use is outside of the United States. And as we go through the different sort of larger products, we'll also note that there's a lot of production of fertilizer is outside of the United States. So while we're very attuned to what's going on here with, you know, next month we'll get prospective plantings and what yields are going to look like, expectations for yields and nutrient use in the United States. A lot of what goes on in the fertilizer market and a lot of what growers end up paying for different products is influenced by things well beyond the US border. And I'll sort of point that out here, looking at US mineral fertilizer use by crop compared to global mineral fertilizer use by crop. So on the right is the US. And as we look here, obviously corn is the dominant user of fertilizer in the US. If we add in soybeans at 11%, wheat at 10%, and then fiber crops, which is mostly cotton, you add those up and we get about 75% of total fertilizer usage in the United States is dominated by those four crops. So we end up spending a lot of time talking about corn, beans, what expectations are around those planted acres and use, and what the volatility might mean to nutrient use and application rates. But when we go over to the rest of the world and look at the global usage, corn's still important. It's almost 20%. But then you see things like rice picking up at 15%, Other oil crops, which are things like canola, palm oil, things along that line are big users. Vegetables, while barely registering at about 2% usage in the United States, are 10% globally. So as you know, I feel like, you know, in larger perspective, when we're talking to growers about fertilizer price and volatility, it can oftentimes come across as a lot of excuses, frankly. We're looking for, you know, oh, how about this? How about this? Here are different ways that that folks feel like we're trying to justify the prices that are being charged. But I think some of that can be combated if we think about and we talk about the different elements that go into the total supply and the total usage of fertilizers, both in the US and globally. And I think that perspective helps go quite a long ways to growers are used to global markets, right? It's such a large percentage, about 20% of US net farm income at large is dependent on trade. They're used to that idea. But then when we talk about fertilizer being 90% of usage is outside of the US, a huge amount of production is outside of the US, I think we have to keep having that conversation because there are a lot of ways that supply chain can go wrong, frankly. So as we move into the longer term on global fertilizer S&D, we are looking at sort of at large, we tend to think about globally fertilizer consumption changing historically, we've thought about it changing at about 2%, adding about 2% per year. And you'll see, so this is IFA data, and this is trued up through fiscal year 2023, and everything beyond that is an estimate. They're about 2-year delay on between reporting and actual happenings, if you will. And you'll see that long-term IFA is projecting that we fall below that 2% per annum increase. And while, you know, 0.5 percentage point doesn't seem like that big of a deal, that's fairly sizable when you're thinking about the size of that sort of fertilizer demand ball. So as we look then at the different nutrients and sort of break that out, you'll see that certainly nitrogen is expected globally to sort of be the dog of the 3 nutrient use. We look at potassium and phosphorus the demand outperforming the overall average. So sort of interesting, and I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, because we're going to look at the S&D comparisons on all 3 of the major macronutrients to kind of see where we might expect, or where we're expecting there to be some easement of some of the constraint, and then on the alternative where we expect there to be a little bit more tightening over time. On the supply side, I'd say that at large supply has outperformed expectations, but the investment cycle is changing in 2 main ways. One, lower fertilizer prices have certainly weakened the investment case for new capacity. So as we think about, you know, nitrogen, and my nitrogen producers would bop me on the head for this, but this is the easiest area to add capacity. And even at that, it takes on average about 3 to 5 years to build a nitrogen facility and about $3 to $5 billion to add that additional capacity. And that's obviously not including the permitting phase. So that's the actual construction. So as we sort of think about, that's a pretty long time horizon. When we think about P&K, the global average from the time that a new mine is sort of thought of to actually coming online is globally the average is about 10 years. So all of this additional capacity that we're looking at that IFA has measured here, you know, 2023 is a true volume at 192 million metric tons of nitrogen. The expectation is that through 2028, that'll grow to 207 million metric tons. That's an increase of 7.8%. And then you can obviously see where the addition and capacity is expected. So not much in Western Europe. If we think, this is Eastern Europe and Central Asia, North America adding quite a lot. But as we think about these lower fertilizer prices and then think about the time horizons on adding additional capacity, that's where this weakened investment case is coming from. And so through 2028, we feel pretty good about the additions in supply. It's the continued 2029, 2030, et cetera, and when you're looking at lower fertilizer prices and lessened demand in that particular nutrient, then we start worrying about and thinking about that additional capacity addition slowing down. As we look at P&K, significant, and this is the same in the same regards, that once you start a mine, start moving towards the creation of a capacity adding mine, it's a little bit hard to slow that ball down. So we look at being up over 9% on P and up over 18% on K. So once those investments have sort of started, it's hard to slow that down. Therefore, when we look at global S&D in 2028 versus 2023, nitrogen expected to largely stay pretty much in balance. Supply growth 7.8%, demand growth 7.8%. Now on phos, you're looking at supply growth at a little over 9% and demand growth being 11.5%. On potassium, supply up 18%, almost 19%, and demand growth being 15%. So, you don't have to be a very good mathematician to see that we would expect nitrogen prices to stay relatively stable over the sort of medium term, phosphorus prices to continue to be relatively high as that market continues to remain relatively constricted, and for potassium prices to continue to lessen a little bit. So always on this, I think, these are generalizations across the major nutrients, but it's always a good thing to dig as deep as one can, because when we look at just say fertilizer NPK total, it would suggest that supply is expected to outstrip demand growth. So in large part, one would expect prices to remain relatively stable or decrease a little bit. But when you dig into those individual products, you see that the expectation is for a decent amount of variability there. So moving into the US perspective, I think before we talk about ag, we have to talk about the US at large. It's because in the policy realm, this all makes sense, or has a significant impact on what we could potentially be looking at it for any policy relief on the ag side. So if you'll stay with me here for just a second, I'd say that, the only people who get things wrong more often than economists are the weathermen. And this is a prime example of the economics field at large getting things pretty wrong. So, in the spring of 2023, Wall Street economists and the Fed Reserve leaders believed that the US economy would slow pretty sharply in 2024. You'll recall you would refresh sort of an MSN type of website, and there would be, every 15 seconds, a new prognostication about how bad the US economy was going to be in response to those high interest rates and the high inflation rates. But it just hasn't, and thankfully hasn't turned out that way at large. So as we look at the end of 2024, unemployment rates remain pretty low. So 2024 unemployment rate was 4.1%, which economists generally think that the US unemployment rate should be about 4 to 5% for the economy to be largely in balance between labor supply and labor demand. So, and if you compare that to 2019, pre-COVID, pre-supply chain disruptions and all the fun that's incurred since then, we were at 3.6% in 2019. So half a percentage point increase, but still pretty low. There are more people working. So the total number of bodies of humans out there in the labor force are higher today than they were in 2019. And while our participation rate is still about a 0.5 percentage point below where we were in 2019. So the sort of thinking about the number of people employed versus working age population, it's still a larger number of people. Productivity growth is good. We tend to think that productivity growth will drop when you get into a really tight labor situation. People know that there aren't as many people sort of waiting in the wings for those jobs. And so you tend to see productivity rates drop, but that hasn't been the case, at least through the end of 2024. Household spending is, starting to be a little concerned there. On sort of since about 1950 through today, the average personal savings rate has been about 5.7%. So at 3.8%, obviously we're starting to see folks save at a lower rate and dip into those savings, which really hadn't been the case until 2023, 2024. And it's certainly well below where we were in 2019. So that's something that's concerning for folks, but still like 3.8% is not that far behind 5.7%. And then as we look at US GDP growth, typically we think that the US economy is doing relatively well if it grows at 2.25%. Again, that's a pretty big ball to turn over and add additional volume to. So in 2024, we're at 2.8% relative to 2.9% in 2023. So at large, and while each individual situation and family situation is different, when you're looking at tax revenues from a federal government perspective, relatively at this particular moment, the US economy is fairly healthy, despite what it might feel like at an individual level. But of course, when we moved into the farm economy, things are significantly different. In 2022, you all are aware of this, but record high net farm income at a little over 2.10 billion. That fell by almost 20% to 146 billion in 2023, and they'll reveal these numbers at the end of this week at the USDA Ag Outlook conference, but they were expecting it to 2024's net farm income to be about 140 billion, which so at large about a 25% decline from over the last 2 years. That of course splits out pretty differently when you look at livestock receipts and livestock growers' health versus crop growers, and a huge amount of that decline being on the crop side. So I think in the fertilizer realm, what folks have been concerned about, and fair enough, and that maybe other people aren't worried about, is that we're looking at a farm income significantly below where we were a couple of years ago. Obviously, growers' bottom lines are being squeezed. So does their fertilizer usage, do we expect that to look like what we were looking at in sort of that 2014 through 2019 lower commodity price era? Or are we expecting it to look a little bit more like 2008? And a lot of our retailers got burned hard in 2008. They purchased a lot of high price product that then just couldn't be sold at that higher price. There wasn't the demand that they were expecting. Obviously, when we look here, a huge drop off in planted acres. We went from it's about a 4 million acre drop, which is obviously pretty significant. At TFI, we're looking in large part that our expectations are that fertilizer demand is going to look a little bit more like the 14 through 19 era, given the fact that 2008, it seems like a bazillion years ago now, but it's important to remember that was a overall US economy blip. We had a recession during that time, and so it wasn't just the ag economy that was sort of in a free fall. It was the US economy at large, and so there wasn't the downside demand for those ag products in the same way that we saw in 2014 through 2019, where yes, commodity prices were a bit lower and we saw some fairly significant drop off in particularly no plant 19. But in large part, that's demand for fertilizer held up. And that's our modus operandi moving forward here. I'm going to skip this one. Now this one's interesting, right? Because these are not 2023 and 2024. Those are USDA numbers from trued up numbers. 2025 through 2029 are factory estimates. Now, I've highlighted here, you know, in 2025, FAPRI's expectations were for corn to be at about 92.7 million. USDA's today, 94.5. So an additional 2 million acres as of February, WASD's expectation above what FAPRI was looking at just a few months ago. So does that change things? Does that mean that we'll look at potentially a lower soybean acres or potentially lower bean acres, lower wheat acres, and still staying at about a 312 million acre year in 2025? Or is this an additional 2 million on top of these other estimates? Obviously that could have a huge impact given that 50% of nitrogen use in the US is corn. We're following this pretty hard, but I think the bigger story here is that long-term, so FAPRI's estimating this acreage based on not only US S&D, but global S&D for a 5-year out period. And they're relatively good. I don't say that, I say that with a little bit of bias. I went to the University of Missouri, that's what FAPRI is based out of, but they are the folks that when they come in and do estimates for USDA, for the Senate and the Ag House, Senate and House Ag committees. And lots of times it's the FAPRI estimates on planted acres that folks are using for those, for that work. So that being said, you know, their estimate was that long-term that we're about a 312 million acre future. Will that hold up? I don't know. It might not even hold up in this particular year. But I think at large, the takeaway for me here is that their expectation is not that we're going to sort of comfortably sit in that 320 million acre standpoint average, but be a bit below that. Well, as much as one can say 7 or 8 million acres is a bit. All right, so moving into the sort of the next portion and where I'm going to spend more time than probably anybody wants, but is these policy considerations, because that's where we think the most volatility is for the fertilizer market today. So geopolitics have been huge in the fertilizer realm in the last several years. When we think about all of the different conflicts that are going on, a lot of them involve producers and major players in the fertilizer space. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, even Israel is a significant player in some particular products like TSP. And maybe even more importantly, the geography of where some of those products travel are connected to some of these geopolitical challenges. And so that this could be a big deal, particularly in the potash space. So you all are familiar that as far as where we get our globally potash supplies, Canada, Russia, Belarus. And so if we're potentially looking, the potash market could swing pretty hard with either way, depending on how things sort of work out. If we end up having tariffs on Canadian product, obviously that adds quite a lot of upward pressure to potash prices, not just US, but globally. If we see a resolution of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, then that decreases those potential prices. So it's not just an upside potential for that particular product, but downside potential as well, which makes it incredibly difficult for anyone to plan around. Potential for political change in key markets. You know, I think that's always a bit of a standing question, and I won't spend too much time there. But What's going on in the Chinese market with regards to export controls is a big deal. China is the largest producer and consumer of fertilizer in the world. So they've really pulled back from the global market over the last several years. And we can talk a little bit more in a couple minutes, particularly as it relates to phosphates, why that matters. But when you're that big, even the flirtation of re-entering the market has a significant impact on total S&D. And then potential regulations on consumption. This is predominantly a European challenge, but as we've seen in a lot of other ag policy issues, what happens in Europe has a tendency to spread elsewhere. On the US policy side, the Inflation Reduction Act clawbacks could potentially be pretty challenging for the US fertilizer industry, particularly as we're thinking about green ammonia coming onto the market. We've already heard about some projects being mothballed that were expected to come on board because of the questions around those tax incentives that were involved in the IRA. So certainly this is something that we're working hard at TFI to have a conversations with the new administration of fine if you clearly have issues with the IRA, fair enough, but maybe instead of it being going in with a sledgehammer, maybe let's think about a bit more from a scalpel perspective, because there's a lot on the line for the fertilizer sector and many other sectors, but we've had some fairly significant investment as a result of those promised tax incentives. Obviously, the Farm Bill continues to drag on, if I can be frank. We've been negotiating this Farm Bill for a very long time, and at this point, our expectation is that we probably won't see any sizable work. Now, there have been a couple of hearings in the last few weeks, but those seem to be a bit of on the record to make a box checking activity, but likely won't see a Farm Bill negotiated in any significant way until the fall of 2025. Potential Fed and state regs impacting fertilizer consumption. You guys are no stranger to this, being in the Bay, but we're seeing it on nitrogen, in particular, some laws and being proposed and put into place in Oregon and Minnesota, in Maine, that we're a little concerned about having an impact on long term if they spread, what it means for growers and whether or not they'll actually be able to apply product at that 4R recommended rate. EPA regs, we could spend a whole day talking about EPA regs, so I'm not going to, but it's certainly at the back of our mind and something that we're actively working on. And then I have highlighted here tariffs, and then both in the US policy section and in the domino policy considerations. So the US puts tariffs on countries that are importing or exporting products to the United States, and then in turn, those countries then apply tariffs on the US for products that we export into those markets. So obviously, I've talked about potash. That would be a big deal for that particular nutrient. And we'll talk about it a bit more in a minute, but it's also obviously very important on nitrogen as well. So those domino policy considerations, you also have to think about exchange rates, interest rates. Those are all obviously quite interconnected. And then a prolonged low price crop environment. We talked about that at the very beginning with global S&D considerations, particularly on weighing in there. But what does that do to long-term fertilizer demand? And then therefore, several years later, the prospectus to add capacity. I put this up just from this standpoint, and I think that I come from a grower perspective. I worked for American Farm Bureau for over a decade. And our reaction, I think always in the grower community, is, well, why don't we just make more of it? Yes and no, that can be possible in the fertilizer space, easier on nitrogen than than phos or potash. But I put this up here to just at large that we do produce a lot of fertilizer in the US, but we also import a lot of it. And both of those elements are very important to making sure that we're supplying the US grower to their and providing product at the right, well, I'll borrow from 4R, at the right place and frankly at the right price. I'm going to skip that one. And I can come back to this one, but I want to spend just a minute here. As we look at different fertilizer products, you see quite a lot of variety here and I'm speaking mostly to this right-hand column about our reliance on imports as a share of apparent consumption. So we supply over almost 90% of our total ammonia consumption in the US is produced domestically, but that means 12% is imported. And then if we bring that down, over 50% of that is coming from Canada. So if we think about potential tariffs on Canadian product, this is largely would result in some more regional impacts, that nitrogen, that ammonia product being predominantly, of course, in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast. So that would be a big deal for those folks in that particular region, maybe not having as far reaching of an impact as maybe on potash, but still significant. When we look at urea, about a third of our consumption is imported. Russia and Qatar being major suppliers. Saudi Arabia, which we'll see particularly in the phosphate side, also popping up as a significant supplier. Ammonium sulfate, we get about 30% of that product from imports. And again, Canada weighs heavily there. Ammonium nitrate, we don't get much, we don't import a ton, but what we do import is coming from Canada. So again, those regional impacts could potentially be significant there. When we think about phosphate, this has changed dramatically over the last decade. Today, we import about a quarter of our MAP needs, and this has changed also as we think about where those products are coming from. So, just a few years ago, we would have talked about a lot of more product coming from Morocco, but today, Saudi Arabia is about a third of the total imported supply of MAP. We look at DAP, about 50% of our use is imported. And again, Saudi Arabia being a huge supplier there. TSP, 100% is imported, and over half of that being Israel. So I point out these different sources just to put in the back of your brain as we think about headlines on any challenges with the U.S. interaction with those countries, or any significant interaction those countries have with others in the region or elsewhere. As we see potential disruption in those areas, that could obviously have a significant trickle down impact on total phos supply and thus prices that our growers are paying in the U.S. I did mention China here, and I will mention that China used to be a fairly significant exporter of phosphate fertilizer. That's changed dramatically. You'll see over here this, we saw a good amount of increase in phos rock output in 2023. A lot of it came from additional Chinese production, but they're keeping all of it domestically. And in large part, yes, they produce a lot of fertilizer, but they're also by far and away the largest producer of phosphate EV batteries. And they're using a ton of phosphate rock into that it's not making its way into the fertilizer space, but it is in that EV battery market. So when we looked at the very beginning, the disparity between projected increases in demand for phosphate fertilizers and projected supply, a good portion of that is this movement of phosphate out of the fertilizer space and into this other sort of industrial use. And then, of course, on potash, we import 98% of our consumption. 87% of that comes from Canada. The rest basically from Russia. So the potential for that to have a significant disruption is obviously significant. And I will just spend here tying back that U.S. economy slide. While it is awful and challenging that the U.S. farm economy is where it is today, I would posit that it's better to, if your economy, your industrial economy is relatively low, it's good to be in that spot when everyone else is doing fairly well. Because there just are fewer people lined up for additional government support. And we've certainly seen quite a lot of that out of the US government in recent years. So, you know, obviously direct payments, PLC, ARC, dairy margin coverage, conservation, basically anything that isn't this green and this gray, those are fairly steady. We saw a bump up in 2019 and 2019 through 2021, really, but in large part, those programs are fairly steady. Where we've seen a lot of variety in the last few years is this market facilitation program that started in 2018 and wrapped up in 2020. You'll recall that occurred during the first Trump administration, where we're offsetting tariff impacts from the tariff war with China. And then this green, this supplemental and ad hoc disaster assistance, that's both, you know, weather related, but also a lot of the COVID related programs. So there is, and you'll recall that this MFP additional payout occurred from CCC funds and wasn't a part of a farm bill. So I mentioned that just in the perspective of there is history from the Trump administration 1.0 of using CCC to help growers in a scenario where where they believe that the grower is disproportionately being impacted as a result of other government activities. And so certainly that, I think that's in the back of a lot of growers' minds of, hey, these tariff situations that we might be getting ourselves into. Just a few years ago, the Trump administration helped assist there with down prices because of a tariff war. So there is that precedent, I think, in the grower community. I'm going to leave this off and end there because as I previously threatened, you give me time and I will fill it all. And I realize we're only a few minutes towards the to the end of our time. I've got one. Hi, Mr. Wilkins. It's nice to see you. Richard and I had overlapped in Farm Bureau many years ago. So the question was, thanks for the presentation. Many of the regenerative ag science pundits are warning of the harm to the soil microbiome of fertilizer salts. Is this on TFI's radar? Are traditional fertilizer suppliers working on innovations to solve the challenges? What advice to growers? Good question, as always. I always found your questions excellent. Yes, so there's a lot of TFI last year. We re-envisioned our research space and are redirecting our research efforts into these more, I'd say, less things that growers are actually focused on today and the challenges that are existing in the growing community, rather than maybe research for the sake of research. Yes, this is something that we're following. We have a research committee. We actually do have a PhD agronomist on staff at TFI. This is one of the things that Leanna follows, is to make sure that TFI is up on the sort of research challenges that are out there currently.
Thank you, Richard, for your question, and thank you, Veronica, for your time. We also have a note from Joseph just saying thank you so much. Are there any other questions at this time for myself, Jarrod, or for Veronica? So in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen with another poll to wrap up before we do credits. So if you guys can see that, go ahead, and then we will revisit if there's any other questions. right, so the QR code is up here. Scan it with your phone. And then open-ended question is, what is one thing that you learned today? And if you still have questions for Veronica, please add it to the Q&A. Fertilizer manufacturing happens all over the world, and the US is a small fraction of overall use. So great answer. Thank you for sharing. While we wait for those questions to come in, as I mentioned earlier, for credits, we have received credits for Pennsylvania, Virginia, Delaware, and the certified crop advisors. If I hear back from Maryland, I will definitely keep you guys posted and in the loop about that opportunity. You guys have signed in, and if you haven't, please let me know for being here today. I moved the screen to the next question. For future events, are there any topics you would like to hear about? Today's event has been recorded, and we will post it on our YouTube page. If there's any information or slides that you wanted, you will be able to access those as well. So one question for you, Veronica, here is can you chime in on the future of the green ammonia industry over the next 4 years?
Thanks for the good question. I think anything that's already built is their expectation is that those facilities will continue to operate. They see those as long-term investments in their product and strategy. Quite frankly, what happens in those tax credits from the IRA will have a big impact on products that haven't broken ground yet. So, there are a couple of facilities that are expected to become operational in 2025. But if you haven't already bought steel, if you haven't already made, started construction, those projects are largely on hold. So the US was globally very much a leader in this space of trying to find ways to incentivize additional green ammonia production. And so as the US goes, as the global market for green ammonia in the next few years, those tax incentives, I can't stress how important they were to actually getting those facilities to actually break ground.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for that question. We were contacted in the question and answer if there's credits for West Virginia. So I did not request West Virginia credits, but I can definitely send them our agenda and who attended for West Virginia and see if we can get you some credits. I have added my email address in the Q&A, which is midatlantic4r@gmail.com. So if you are interested, please do so. Shoot me an email and I'll be happy to work with you. All right. I just learned that certain NRCS plan writing grant programs, Central Virginia Bay, have been put on hold. Yes, a lot of funding is currently frozen, but we're working through those challenges. Hi, Jenell, Shannon from MDA. If you'd like to chat about credits, I'd be happy to make sure we can get this approved. Thank you, Shannon. I have submitted everything. I just assumed maybe somebody was out on leave or vacation, so I wasn't hugely concerned, but we'll be in touch. Thank you so much. All right. Moving back to the shared screen, please provide any feedback or opportunities for future webinars. So thank you guys for filling out the survey. I thought it was a great addition to our day. Thank you all for your questions. The sign out sheet is going to be added to the chat box now. If you have anything else, we'll be online for a few more minutes, but thank you all for joining here today. And we appreciate it. Have a good week.